Mister, can you eat with me?
Nobody dared to disturb Diyun during his private dinner. In the heart of Seoul's most elite district, he was a man of absolute silence and lethal reputation. No one moved without his permission. No one spoke without being addressed. But a little girl didn't know the rules. 7 years old, wearing a pink dress that sparkled under gold chandeliers, and holding a white plate with both hands, she bypassed a wall of black-suited bodyguards as if they were made of glass. She stopped at the most dangerous table in the room, looked directly into the eyes of the man who ran the city's underworld, and whispered, "Can you eat with me?" In 30 minutes. That simple request would force Diyun to confront a ghost from his past and pull him into a war where his heart was the only thing at stake. The address to the audience: if you've ever wondered what happens when the most powerful man in the room meets the only person who isn't afraid of him, welcome. Subscribe and stay with us, because this story is about to show you that even the coldest empires can be brought to their knees by a single act of innocence. Diyun had not come to this restaurant to find a family. He had come to confirm his dominance. As the head of the city's most powerful syndicate, his life was a series of calculated moves, high-stakes negotiations, and a perpetual wariness of the food on his plate. He hadn't eaten a meal without a taster in over a decade. He was good at his job. He was better at staying alive. And he had every intention of finishing his wine and disappearing back into the shadows of his guarded estate, unbothered and untouchable. The private dining room was extraordinary in that cold, intimidating way that only true power can command. Chandeliers caught the light like polished diamonds, casting long, sharp shadows against the marble floors. Men in tailored suits stood like statues against the walls, their hands folded, their eyes scanning for threats that didn't exist in a room this secure. Diyun had spent his life in rooms like this. He was not impressed by the luxury, nor was he softened by the atmosphere. He sat at the center table, a glass of deep red wine in front of him, leaning slightly forward with a jawline that looked carved from granite. He was a man who commanded space without saying a word. To him, the world was divided into two categories: assets and threats. He was halfway through his wine, staring into the dark liquid and thinking of his next move against a disloyal lieutenant, when the heavy silence of the room was punctured, not by a gunshot or a shout, but by the soft, rhythmic tap of small shoes on marble. He didn't look up at first. He waited for his security to handle the intrusion, but the footsteps didn't stop. They came closer, steady and brave, until a shadow fell across his table. A shadow that didn't belong to a man in a suit. He looked up, his dark eyes focused and suspicious, and found himself staring at a splash of vibrant pink. A little girl with rich brown skin and thick, dark curls stood there, her hands trembling slightly as she held her plate. She wasn't an asset, and she didn't look like a threat. But as Diyun looked into her expressive, serious eyes, he felt the air in the room change. For the first time in years, the Mafia Boss of Seoul found himself at a loss for words. The silence in the room was heavy. It was a kind of silence that only follows a man like Diyun. He sat at the long table, the white cloth looking bright against his black suit. To anyone else, this was a beautiful dinner. To Diyun, it was a golden cage. Every wall was guarded. Every door was watched. He was the most powerful man in Seoul, but he could not remember the last time he felt relaxed. He swirled the red wine in his glass, watching the light bounce off his silver watch. He was wealthy beyond words, yet his life was made of stone and shadows. His bodyguards stood like frozen statues in the corners. They were there to stop bullets, not to make conversation. Diyun liked it that way. In his world, words were dangerous and trust was a ghost. He took a small sip of wine, his sharp eyes scanning the room out of habit. He was looking for a threat, a hidden blade, or a disloyal face. He was not looking for a child. Then, the heavy doors at the far end of the hall creaked. The guards moved instantly, their hands going to their jackets. Diyun did not move. He only lowered his glass, his gaze narrowing. Out of the darkness of the hallway came a splash of bright pink. It was a little girl. She looked like a lost flower in a desert concrete. She was beautiful. Her skin was a rich, warm brown that glowed under the golden lights. Her hair was a crown of thick, dark curls tied back in a soft ponytail. She didn't look like she belonged in a place full of cold men and hard secrets. She was wearing a pink dress decorated with tiny silk flowers and a large bow set on her back. In her small hands, she carried a white ceramic plate. The head bodyguard stepped forward to block her path. He was a giant of a man with a scarred face. He looked down at her with a glare that would make grown men cry. But the girl did not cry. She did not even flinch. She simply walked around him. She moved with a quiet braveness that made the room feel even smaller. The guards looked at Diyun, waiting for a signal to remove her. Diyun raised a single hand. It was a silent command to stand down. He was curious. No one ever walked toward her with their head held high unless they wanted something. But this child didn't look like she wanted power or money. She stopped right at the edge of his table. Up close, Diyun could see the detail of her pink beaded bracelet. He could see her large, expressive eyes. They were dark and full of a serious kind of weight. She looked at him, and for the first time in a decade, Diyun felt like someone was actually seeing him, not just the boss. She held the plate toward him. It was a simple meal, nothing like the expensive food on his own table. Her lips were pressed together in a thoughtful line. The silence stretched out, long and tense. Diyun leaned forward, his expensive suit crinkling slightly. He looked at the girl, then at the plate, then back at her. The air in the restaurant felt different now. The coldness was still there, but the pink dress and the small, brave girl had cracked the surface of his perfect, lonely world. Diyun stared at the white plate in the girl's hands. His mind was already working like a machine. He wondered who had sent her in his world. Children were sometimes used as messengers or even distractions. He looked at the food she carried. It was a simple serving of rice and vegetables. Was it poison? Was there a note hidden underneath the rice? He looked past her at the large doors, expecting an assassin to burst in while he was distracted by her pink dress. Who told you to come here? Diyun asked. His voice was like a low growl, cold and sharp. He didn't use a friendly tone. He used a voice that made his enemies tremble. The little girl didn't shake. She didn't run away. She just looked at his half-empty table, and then back at him. Nobody, she whispered. Her voice was soft, but it carried clearly through the quiet restaurant. I just saw you sitting all by yourself. My mama told me that no one should ever have to eat alone. It makes the food taste like nothing. Diyun felt a strange pull in his chest. He was trained to spot lies. He looked for a twitch in her eye or a nervous shake in her hands. He saw none of that. He saw only a child who looked tired and very, very lonely. Her rich brown skin was dusty at the edges, and her pink dress had a small tear near the hem. She wasn't a spy. She was just a girl with a plate and a big heart. Where's your mother now? He asked. He watched her face closely. Mina looked down at her shoes. Her curly hair fell forward, hiding her eyes for a moment. She's gone, she said quietly. I'm the only one left. The guards in the background shifted their feet. They were confused. Their boss usually handled threats with a snap of his fingers. But here he was, having a conversation with a 7-year-old. Diyun looked at the empty chair across from him. It was a chair meant for powerful partners or beautiful dates. It was not meant for a child in a pink dress. Sit, Diyun said. It was a command, but the hardness had left his eyes. Mina climbed into the large velvet chair. Her legs dangled high above the floor, her feet swinging back and forth. She set her plate on the table next to his expensive wine. She looked at him and gave a tiny, shy smile. Diyun didn't smile back, but he didn't call his guards either. He picked up his fork and began to eat, watching her do the same. Outside the restaurant, the world was already changing. Men in black cars were typing on their phones. The news was spreading through the city like a fire. The untouchable Diyun was sharing his table with a stranger. By the time they finished their first bite, every boss in Seoul knew that something impossible had happened. The man of stone had opened his door, and a little girl had walked right in. Diyun knew he was making a mistake. He knew his enemies would see this as a weakness. But as he watched Mina eat, he realized he didn't care. For the first time in years, the silence in the room didn't feel quite so heavy. The meal ended in a quiet that felt different than before. Diyun did not send the girl away to an orphanage or leave her on the street. Instead, he brought her to his estate. It was a massive house made of glass and black stone, sitting high on a hill. While Mina slept in the guest room, still wearing her pink beaded bracelet, Duyin sat in his dark office. He tapped a finger on his mahogany desk. He had a job to do. He needed to know exactly who this girl was and how she had ended up at his table. He called his best investigator. "Find out everything," he ordered. "Her name is Mina. She is 7 years old. Check the records for the last 6 months." A few hours later, a file appeared on his computer screen. Duyin scrolled through the digital pages. His eyes stopped on a police report from a rainy night. In October, there was a photo of a small apartment building. It was a place he knew well. He had sent 20 men there to handle a rival gang. It had been a messy night. He remembered the report saying the target was gone, but there had been extra damage. He looked at the names of the people who lived in apartment 4B. They were a young couple who had nothing to do with the mafia. They were just teachers. They had been caught in the crossfire of his bullets. And there, in a family photo attached to the file, was Mina. She was younger in the picture, laughing between her parents, wearing a small yellow headband. Duyin felt a strange, cold shiver run down his back. He had ordered that attack. He had signed the paper that led to the smoke and the fire. He had never thought about the people inside the walls. To him, they were just numbers on a page. But now, one of those numbers was sleeping just down the hall in a pink dress. He closed the laptop and walked to the large window. He looked out at the lights of Seoul. He was a man who lived by rules. Rule number 1 was to never feel sorry for anyone. But as he thought about Mina's empty plate and her gone mother, he felt a heavy weight in his chest. It was a flicker of a feeling he had not felt in many years. It was guilt. It was a sharp, biting pain that told him he was the reason she was alone. The sun began to rise, turning the sky a dusty purple. His head of security, a man named Sang-hoon, walked into the room. "The car is ready to take the child to the city shelter, sir," Sang-hoon said. Duyin watched the bird fly past the window. He didn't turn around. "No," he said. His voice was flat but firm. "She stays here." Sang-hoon paused, his face full of surprise. "Sir, it is not safe. The other families will think you are getting soft. A child is a target." "She stays," Duyin repeated. He finally turned, his jaw tight and his eyes hard. "It is only temporary. I will find a safe place for her later. But for now, she is under my protection. If anyone asks, tell them she is my guest. If anyone touches a hair on her head, they deal with me." Duyin knew he was breaking his own rules. But for the first time, he didn't care about the empire. He only cared about the girl in the pink dress. The John estate was a place of straight lines and cold surfaces. Everything was made of gray marble, polished glass, or dark wood. It was a house built for a man who did not want to be bothered. There were no family photos on the walls, and no messy piles of shoes by the door. But within a week, Mina began to change the air of the giant mansion. It started with small things. A bright pink beaded bracelet was left on the edge of the fountain in the hall. A coloring book appeared on the expensive leather sofa in the library. Then came the room. Duyin had ordered his staff to turn one of the guest suites into a space for her. He told them to make it comfortable, but he didn't expect the result. When he walked past the open door, he saw walls that were now a soft, warm peach color. There were white fluffy rugs on the floor, and a bed pile high with stuffed animals. It was a bright, happy island in the middle of this dark ocean. The guards struggled the most. They were men trained to fight and kill. They were used to long shifts of standing still and looking scary. Now, they found themselves constantly looking down to make sure they didn't trip over a stray toy. One afternoon, Duyin watched from the balcony as Mina ran through the garden. Her dark, bouncy curls flew behind her as she chased a butterfly. She ran right up to Sang-hoon, the toughest guard on the team. She stopped, looked up at his scarred face, and offered him a plastic flower she had found. The guard froze. He looked at the flower, then at his boss on the balcony, then back at the girl. His hand, which usually rested on his weapon, twitched. He slowly reached out and took the toy, tucking it into his vest. Duyin saw the man's sharp jawline soften for just a second. Mina laughed and ran away, the sound of her joy ringing out through the quiet gardens. It was a sound that had been missing from this estate for a very long time. Duyin found it harder to focus on his work. Usually, his days were filled with reading ledgers and checking bank accounts. He sat in his office, but his eyes kept drifting to the security monitors on his desk. Instead of watching the front gate for enemies, he found himself looking for the girl in the pink dress. He watched her eat breakfast with a messy face. He watched her try to teach a serious bodyguard how to play hide-and-seek. One evening, he was sitting in the library when Mina walked in. She didn't ask for permission. She just climbed onto the chair next to him and started humming a song. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his black suit. "You always wear black," she said, tilting her head. "Don't you like colors?" Duyun looked at her small, radiant face. He looked at the bright pink ribbon in her hair. He realized that for years he had lived in a world without color because he thought it made him strong. But as he sat there with the little girl, he realized the black and gray world was just lonely. He didn't answer her, but he didn't move his arm away. He let her stay, realizing that the temporary guest was slowly turning his cold cage into something that felt dangerously like a home. The dining room was filled with the smell of expensive steak and the quiet sound of silver forks hitting plates. Duyun sat at the head of the table. To his left sat Minho, his second in command. Minho was a sharp man with cold eyes who only cared about power and profit. Across from them sat Mina. She was wearing a fresh pink dress with tiny beads that caught the light. She was trying her best to eat her peas one by one, her large eyes focused on her plate. For most of the dinner, Minho talked about money and territory. He talked about rival gangs and shipments that needed to be moved. Duyun listened, but his eyes kept drifting toward Mina. He noticed how she smiled when she finally caught a pea on her fork. He noticed how she leaned her head to the side, her thick curls bouncing as she moved. Finally, Minho stopped talking about business. He leaned back and took a slow sip of his red wine. He looked at Mina with a look of disgust. "The men are talking, Duyun," Minho said. His voice was loud enough to make Mina stop eating. "They say the great boss has traded his gun for a doll. They say this house has become a playground. It is a distraction, a weakness." Mina's hands froze. She looked up, her lower lip trembling just a little bit. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the mean tone in the man's voice. She looked at Duyun, her dark eyes wide and searching for safety. Duyun did not raise his voice. He did not move quickly. He slowly set his glass down on the white cloth. The room went deathly silent. Even the guards at the door held their breath. Duyun turned his head and looked directly at Minho. His expression was like a wall of ice. "She is not a distraction," Duyun said. His voice was very low, which was much scarier than a scream. "She is a guest in my home. And in this house, we do not speak to guests that way." Minho laughed, but sounded nervous. "Come on, boss. She is just a kid. She doesn't belong here. We are in the middle of a war. You are getting soft over a girl who isn't even yours." Duyun stood up slowly. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across Minho's face. He used the full weight of his authority, the power that made him the most feared man in the city. But he wasn't doing it to win a fight or gain a street. He was doing it for the girl in the pink dress. "If you ever speak about her again," Duyun whispered, "or if you even look at her with that face, you will not have a seat at this table. In fact, you will not have a seat in this city. Am I clear?" Minho's face went pale. He looked at his wine glass, then back at Duyun's hard eyes. He realized he had pushed too far. "Clear, boss," he muttered, looking down at his plate. Duyun sat back down. He reached out and gently pushed a bowl of fruit closer to Mina. "Eat your dessert, Mina," he said softly. The hardness left his voice when he spoke to her. Mina looked at him, gave a small nod, and picked up a slice of apple. For the first time, Duyun had used his power to protect a child's peace, and it felt more important than any territory he had ever won. The peace of the evening did not last long. Rain began to drum against the high glass windows of the estate, masking the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. Inside, the lights flickered once, then died, plunging the massive house into a thick, heavy darkness. Duyun stood up instantly. He didn't need light to know that trouble had arrived. In the distance, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the hallway. "Mina, get down!" Duyun shouted. He didn't wait for her to move. He reached across the table, grabbed her by the waist, and tucked her into a small, dark space beneath the heavy oak dining table. "Stay there. Do not make a sound until I come for you." Mina's eyes were wide with terror, her pink dress rustling as she curled into a ball. She squeezed her eyes shut and gripped her beaded bracelet. Dian stepped back and pulled a heavy black pistol from his waistband. He felt a cold rage rising in his chest. This was not a random attack. The security codes had been bypassed. This was a betrayal. Suddenly, the dining room doors were kicked open. Flashlights cut through the dark, and 3 men rushed in. In the center was Minho, the lieutenant who had mocked Mina only hours before. He wasn't looking for money or documents. His eyes were scanning the floor for the girl. "I told you she was a weakness, boss." Minho yelled over the sound of the rain. "Look at you, hiding behind a table for a child. You've lost your edge. It's time for someone else to lead." Diyun didn't waste time with words. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He didn't fight like a man trying to win a territory. He fought like a beast protecting its young. He fired 2 shots, dropping the men flanking Minho before they could even raise their weapons. The room filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of breaking glass. Minho lunged forward with a knife, his face twisted in a mask of hate. He tried to dive toward the table where Mina was hiding. Diyun's heart hammered against his ribs. Not out of fear for himself, but out of a desperate need to keep that pink dress from being stained with red. He intercepted Minho, grabbing the man's wrist with a grip that snapped bone. The fight was brutal and short. Diyun used his hands and feet with ferocity he had never shown in his years of mafia wars. He wasn't thinking about the great boss or his reputation. He was only thinking about the small, brave girl who had asked him to eat with her. He slammed Minho against a marble wall with enough force to crack the stone. The lieutenant fell to the floor, unconscious and broken. The rest of the estate was a storm of noise as Sang-hoon and the loyal guards finished off the remaining attackers. When the silence finally returned, it was heavy and thick. Duyun's breathing was ragged. He dropped his gun and sank to his knees beside the table. His suit was torn and his knuckles were bleeding, but he didn't care. "Mina," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's over. You can come out." Slowly, a small hand reached out and touched his arm. Mina crawled out from the shadows. She looked at the mess in the room, then at Duyun's face. She didn't scream. Instead, she reached up and wiped a smudge of dust from his cheek. In that moment, Diyun realized that the silence of his house had been broken forever, but he was no longer alone in the dark. The estate was quiet again, but it was a heavy, broken kind of quiet. Blue and red lights from security cars flashed against the wet windows, dancing over the holes in the walls. Diyun sat on a low bench in the hallway, his head resting against the cold stone. His black suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was stained with dirt and a bit of blood from a cut on his shoulder. His hands were steady, but his heart was still racing. The doctors wanted to check his pulse, but he had sent them away with a sharp look. He wanted to be alone. He looked down at his boots, thinking about the chaos. He had spent his whole life building a wall around himself so that nothing could hurt him. He had thought that being alone was the same thing as being safe. But tonight, the wall had cracked. Minho had been right about one thing. Diyun was different now. The problem was that Minho thought the change was a weakness. The sound of soft footsteps made Diyun look up. Mina was standing a few feet away. She was still wearing her pink dress, though it was wrinkled and dusty from hiding under the table. Her thick curls were a bit messy, and her large dark eyes were full of concern. She didn't look at the broken glass or the guards cleaning up the mess. She only looked at him. She walked closer, her small shoes clicking softly on the marble. She reached out and touched his hand. Her skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold air in the house. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I've been worse, Mina," Diyun said. He tried to make his voice sound strong, but it came out sounding tired. "Go back to your room with the maid. It isn't a good time to be out here." Mina didn't move. Instead, she reached for her wrist. She carefully unclipped the delicate pink beaded bracelet she always wore. She took his large, scarred hand and placed the bracelet in his palm. The tiny beads felt light and strange against his skin. "It's for luck," she said, looking him right in the eye. "My mama gave it to me, so I wouldn't be scared. Now I want you to have it. You saved me, so now the luck belongs to you. Do-yoon stared at the small circle of pink beads. He was a man who dealt in millions of dollars and heavy weapons. He had never owned something so small and yet so heavy with meaning. He looked at Mina's brave, serious face. She had lost her parents. She had seen a battle in her home, and yet she was worried about him. In that moment, a light went on in Do-yoon's mind. For years, he had survived because he had nothing to lose. He had fought because he was angry. But tonight, he had fought because he loved something. He realized that Mina wasn't a weight pulling him down. She was the reason he had stood up. She wasn't distraction. She was the purpose. He closed his fingers around the bracelet, hiding the pink beads inside his fist. The guilt he felt for her past was still there, but was joined by a new, fierce feeling. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a protector. He looked at Mina and gave her a small, real nod. He realized that as long as she was in this house, he was not just surviving. He was finally living. He stood up, ignored the pain in his shoulder, and walked her back to her peach-colored room, keeping the luck of the pink beads close to his heart. The pink bracelet stayed in Do-yoon's pocket for the next 3 days. Every time he touched the smooth beads, he felt a sharp reminder of the world he lived in. He looked at the walls of his study, which were filled with maps of territories and lists of debts. For years, these things had been his pride. Now, they just felt like a threat to the little girl sleeping in the peach-colored room down the hall. He realized that a house cannot hold both a war and a childhood. He had to make a choice. He called a meeting of the remaining leaders. This was not a dinner. There was no wine or fancy food. Do-yoon stood at the head of the table, his face as hard as the stone floors. He told them he was changing the business. He was closing the illegal docks, stopping the street fights, and selling off the parts of the empire that brought nothing but blood. The men looked at each other in shock. They whispered that he was throwing away a fortune. "I am not asking for your opinion," Do-yoon said, his voice echoing through the cold room. "I am telling you how it is. We are moving into legal trade, construction, shipping, and real estate. If you want to stay, you follow the new rules. If you want the old life, take your money and leave Seoul tonight." It was the hardest deal he had ever closed. In the Mafia, walking away is often more dangerous than staying. He spent the next week in a blur of phone calls and legal papers. He met with lawyers and city officials, using his power to erase the dark marks on his name. He was dismantling his own throne, piece by piece. He was stripping away his armor, knowing that his enemies would see him as an easy target. But every time he felt a moment of doubt, he thought about Mina's laugh in the garden. He thought about her pink dress and her brave, dark eyes. One evening, he watched the workers removing the heavy security bars from the library windows. He wanted more light in the house. He wanted the sun to reach every corner where shadows used to hide. Sang-hoon walked up to him, looking at the empty walls where weapons used to hang. "You are giving up a lot for her, sir," the guard said quietly. "I am gaining a life, Sang-hoon," Do-yoon replied. He reached into his pocket and felt the pink beads. "I can't be the man she needs if I am still the man the city fears. She deserves a father who comes home with clean hands." The process was not easy. There were threats from rivals who thought he had gone soft. There were moments when he almost reached for his gun out of habit, but the cleaning continued. He sold the dark clubs and bought parks. He closed the secret warehouses and opened schools. He was building a new world, not for himself, but for a girl who had once walked up to a monster and asked him to eat. By the end of the month, the boss was gone. In his place was a man who was tired, but for the first time in his life, he was not looking over his shoulder. He had closed the most important deal of his life, and the price was his empire. It was a price he was more than happy to pay. The sun poured into the dining room, turning the once cold marble floors into a sea of golden light. The heavy black curtains were gone, replaced by thin white ones that danced in the morning breeze. There was no smell of gunpowder or old secrets in the air. Instead, the house smelled like fresh orange juice and toasted bread. The silence of the estate had changed, too. It was no longer the heavy, scary silence of a fortress. It was the quiet, peaceful hum of a home waking up. Do-yoon sat at the same long table where his journey had started, but he looked like a different man. He was not wearing a stiff black suit or a sharp silk tie. He wore a simple, relaxed blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His jaw was no longer tight with suspicion, and the tired lines around his eyes had softened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't listening for footsteps in the hallway or watching the door for a threat. There were no bodyguards standing in the shadows. He had sent them home or moved them to his new legal offices. He didn't need a wall of men to feel safe anymore. Across from him sat Mina. She was wearing a new pink dress, one with even more silk flowers than the first one he had seen. Her thick, curly hair was piled high on her head, held together by a bright ribbon. She was humming a happy song as she spread jam on a piece of toast. She looked healthy and radiant, her warm brown skin glowing in the sunlight. She was no longer the lonely orphan from the gala. She was a girl who knew she was loved. On the table between them sat a small bowl. Inside it lay the pink beaded bracelet. Diyun didn't wear it on his wrist, but he kept it where he could see it every day. It was his reminder of the luck she had given him, the luck that had allowed him to survive his old life and build a better one. Mina looked up from her breakfast and caught him watching her. She gave him a wide, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. She pointed to the eggs on his plate that he hadn't touched yet. "You're doing it again," she teased. "You're thinking too much instead of eating." Diyun felt a warm laugh bubble up in his chest. It was a sound he used to think was a sign of weakness. Now, it was his favorite thing about himself. He looked at the girl who had changed everything with one simple question on a dark, rainy night. He thought about the man he used to be, a man of stone who collected money, but had no soul. That man was gone, buried under the weight of a pink dress and a child's trust. He picked up his fork and looked at Mina. His dark eyes were full of a peace he had never known. "You're right, Mina," he said softly. His voice was clear and kind. "I remember a very brave girl asked me something a long time ago. She asked if I could eat with her." Mina tilted her head, her curls bouncing. "And what is the answer?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Diyun took a bite of his breakfast and smiled back at her. "The answer is yes, Mina. I will eat with you, today and every day after." As they sat together in the sun-drenched room, the transformation was finally complete. The boss was gone and the father had arrived. The golden cage was open, and for the first time in his life, Diyun was truly free. Rice he was more than happy to pay.